In the summer of 2025, a team of geneticists cracked open a biological sequence that had been locked inside ancient bones for 5,000 years. And what they found inside didn't match anything in the database. Not a single known population, not a single recognized lineage. It matched something that, according to mainstream archaeology, had absolutely no business being there. The scientists ran the test again. The result was the same, and then they went very quiet. If you're ready to explore one of the most disorienting mysteries in the history of human civilization, you're exactly where you need to be, and you're going to want to stay until the very end. Picture the moment the sequencing results appeared on screen. A sterile laboratory somewhere in Northern Europe, the kind of room where the air smells like antiseptic and time. The hum of refrigeration units keeps a steady, low pulse beneath the silence. A researcher leans forward in her chair, at the blue glow of a monitor painting shadows across her face. On the screen, a genomic map of a man who walked the earth in 4,500 BCE. A man who lived in southern Mesopotamia, in the region we now call Iraq, in a civilization that modern history credits as the very first on the face of this planet. The Sumerians. And the data scrolling across that screen refuses to make sense. The Sumerians are not supposed to be mysterious anymore. That's the official position. They built cities while the rest of humanity was still living in scattered farming communities. They invented writing, constructed towering step pyramids called ziggurats that scraped the sky, and developed legal codes, medical texts, and astronomical charts of stunning precision. Cuneiform writing, those distinctive wedge-shaped impressions pressed into clay, appeared in Sumerian settlements around 3,200 BCE, to thousands of years before most civilizations had even conceived of recording language. These were not simple people. But here's the question that archaeology has been quietly failing to answer for a century. Where did they come from? And now that the DNA is finally talking, the answer may be more unsettling than anyone was prepared for. What if the Sumerians were not simply a local people who gradually advanced? And what if the DNA locked in their ancient bones tells a story of origins so unexpected, so geographically impossible, that it forces us to rewrite everything we thought we knew about the dawn of civilization? That is the question sitting at the center of everything that follows. And the story begins, as so many great mysteries do, not with a spectacular discovery, but with a sealed container, a climate-controlled vault, and a result that no one expected. To understand why those test results were so alarming, you have to understand the Sumerian problem. Archaeologists have been calling it that for nearly 100 years. Not because the Sumerians are poorly understood. In many ways, they are remarkably well documented. But because of one deeply strange fact that refuses to go away. Sumerian is a language isolate. That means it belongs to no known language family, ancient or modern. It is not related to Arabic, not related to ancient Egyptian, not related to the Semitic languages that surrounded it in Mesopotamia, not related to any Indo-European tongue. Linguists have combed through every known language on Earth, all 6,900 or so, and found nothing that shares a common ancestor with Sumerian. Not a single word root, not a single grammatical echo. The Sumerians called themselves Sag-Giga, the black-headed people, and they wrote of their origins in cosmic terms that were dismissed as mythology. But the language itself stood apart from all humanity, like a voice from a different room. And that alone should make you wonder, if no known population speaks a language related to Sumerian, then who were the people who invented it? And where did they come from before they arrived in Mesopotamia? Some researchers have spent careers on that question. There are those who believe the Sumerians migrated from an elevated region to the east, possibly from the Zagros Mountains or the Iranian Plateau. yet carrying their impossible language with them as they descended into the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates. Others point to the shores of the Persian Gulf, proposing a now drowned coastal civilization, an entire culture swallowed by rising sea levels after the last ice age, whose survivors sailed inland and gave rise to everything we call Sumer. The idea sounds extraordinary, but consider this. New research published in 2025 by archaeologists studying tidal sediment patterns in ancient Mesopotamia found physical evidence that the geography of southern Iraq was dramatically different 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. The sea reached much further inland. Entire landscapes that now exist as dry desert once sat underwater. What if the civilization we call Sumerian was not born in Mesopotamia, but washed ashore there? And now, here's where it gets strange. That's because the DNA doesn't point to either of those places. Not the mountains, not the Persian Gulf coast. When researchers analyzed genetic material extracted from ancient Mesopotamian remains, the markers they found pointed, with striking consistency, toward a population cluster centered not in Iraq at all, but far to the north, far to the northwest, toward the mountains of the Caucasus, toward what is now Armenia. That's the first thing the genetics community struggled to explain, and it would not be the last. The bones that sparked the 2025 controversy were not new finds. That's an important detail that gets lost in the headlines. These were remains that had been sitting in museum storage for decades, carefully cataloged, largely unstudied at the genomic level, because the technology to extract reliable ancient DNA from such degraded specimens simply didn't exist until recently. Picture those museum vaults. Long shelves of labeled boxes in dim-lit rooms. Whilst the air dry and still, entire human lives reduced to numbered fragments of calcium. A femur from a burial site outside Nippur. A mandible recovered from a lair beneath the city of Uruk. Bone fragments from the ancient city of Kish, which Sumerian king lists claim was the first city to receive kingship after the Great Flood. A flood, incidentally, that Sumerian texts described in detail thousands of years before it appeared in the Book of Genesis. For decades, those bones were historical artifacts. In 2025, they became something else entirely. Evidence. The breakthrough that made this testing possible came from a technique called low-coverage whole genome sequencing, which can now reconstruct meaningful genetic profiles even from specimens that are severely degraded by heat, moisture, and time. This same technology was deployed in July 2025 by researchers at the Francis Crick Institute and Liverpool John Moores University, when they published the first complete genome of an ancient Egyptian in the journal Nature. That genome, extracted from a man buried at a site called Nuweirat and radiocarbon, dated to somewhere between 2855 and 2570 BCE, produced a finding that shocked the archaeology world. Yet, approximately 20% of his genetic ancestry traced directly back to the Eastern Fertile Crescent, back to ancient Mesopotamia. An Old Kingdom Egyptian, one of the people who built the pyramids, carried a significant portion of Sumerian-linked genetic ancestry. The mainstream interpretation offered a cautious explanation. Ancient migration, trade routes, population movement. But some researchers looked at that 20% and asked a very different question. What if the genetic connection between these two civilizations, the only two that appeared almost simultaneously, with full-blown writing and monumental architecture and complex religious systems, was not accidental? What if whatever force created the Sumerians also reached into Egypt? Is it possible that a third population, a source population that archaeology has never identified, seeded both civilizations? Could it be that the real origin of the Sumerians points not to any known region, but to a people who simply have no other descendants? That is not a fringe idea. It is a legitimate open question in the field of archaeogenetics. And the 2025 DNA results took that question and made it burn. Here's what the data actually showed, as best as the research community has been able to reconstruct from the available reports. The ancient Sumerian samples, particularly those from the older strata of sites like Kish and Nippur, carried a Y chromosome haplogroup designation that placed them genetically closest not to modern populations in Iraq, not to the Arab world, not even to modern Iranians, but to populations from the Armenian highlands. The specific branch, noted in genetic community discussions as GFG 58137, falls under haplogroup G2 alpha 2, and a lineage most densely concentrated today in the Caucasus region. A people who, by all archaeological accounts, lived in the flat river delta of southern Mesopotamia, in a landscape utterly unlike any mountain range, were genetically almost identical to the inhabitants of the high Caucasian peaks. How? Why? And consider what this haplogroup G2 alpha means in the broader genetic story of humanity. It is one of the oldest Y chromosome lineages in Eurasia. It is found, albeit at low frequencies, scattered across the Mediterranean, across the Middle East, occasionally in South Asia and even East Asia. It's the kind of genetic signature that whispers, "We were here long before the populations that replaced us." What if the Sumerians were not a people who arose from the land of two rivers, but a remnant people, survivors of something older, who made their final stand in the alluvial plains and built an entire civilization before vanishing into the genetic noise of subsequent migrations? That idea, the idea of the Sumerians as genetic survivors, is supported by something else the DNA revealed. A study published in the journal BMCE. Evolutionary Biology examined Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA variation in the marsh Arabs of southern Iraq, the wetlands people, yet whose culture and geography places them as the most direct physical descendants of the ancient Sumerians. The genetic stratification they found was striking. There was evidence of a deep, ancient genetic layer, distinct from the later Semitic populations who flooded into Mesopotamia, that corresponded specifically to the emergence of Sumerian urban culture. In other words, the DNA of the Sumerian cultural horizon was biologically different from the people around them. Not slightly different. Measurably, demonstrably different. And then that layer gets covered over, buried by the genetics of subsequent conquest and migration, like an archaeological stratum buried under centuries of sediment. Now here's what makes that truly bizarre. Because if the Sumerians were genetically distinct from their neighbors, distinct from the Semitic Akkadians who lived alongside them and eventually replaced them, then the conventional story of Sumerian origins as a gradual local evolution has a serious problem. Genetically distinct populations don't simply emerge from a local population without a migration event. Something had to move them there, some displacement, some journey across a landscape, some origin point that has never been found. And the location that the genetics keeps pointing back to, those Armenian highlands, those Caucasian mountains, is a place filled with extraordinary archaeological mysteries of its own. Göbekli Tepe sits in the mountains of southeastern Turkey, within the cultural and geographic orbit of exactly that Caucasus Armenian region. It is the oldest known complex structure built by human hands on Earth, thus with construction dating back to approximately 9,500 BCE, 7,000 years before the first Sumerian cities. 7,000 years. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers, or at least that's what the textbooks say. They carved massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 10 tons, decorated with intricate bas-relief animals, foxes, vultures, crocodiles, or insects rendered with an artistic sophistication that defies the label primitive. They organized labor on a monumental scale. They clearly had complex social hierarchies, symbolic systems, and possibly a religious tradition of startling depth. And then, around 10,000 BCE, they buried the site deliberately, covered it, intentionally sealed it, walked away. What if the people who built Göbekli Tepe are the same people whose descendants, thousands of years later, arrived in Mesopotamia and became the Sumerians? What if the genetic signature pointing from Sumer to the Caucasian mountains is a biological echo of a journey that began at the world's first temple and ended in the world's first city? That question cannot be answered yet. The ancient DNA from Göbekli Tepe itself has not been fully analyzed. But some researchers believe it is only a matter of time before that data becomes available, and they believe, when it does, it will complete a genetic trail that stretches from the mountains of Anatolia to the river deltas of Iraq. A trail that will force a fundamental rethinking of how civilization began. There are those who say, this is the discovery that will reshape everything. But let's take a step back. Because there's another layer to this story, one that most mainstream scientists refuse to touch. And it lives in the clay tablets themselves. In the words the Sumerians left behind about who they were and where they came from. The Sumerians were profoundly literate. By the time writing was standardized around 3200 BCE, they were already recording not just trade transactions and agricultural inventories, but cosmological texts, royal genealogies, and mythological histories of astonishing complexity. And among the most significant of these texts are the ones describing the Anunnaki, a word that translates roughly as those who came from the sky to the earth. The Anunnaki are not minor figures in Sumerian religion. They are the central divine actors in the Sumerian understanding of human existence. They are described as powerful beings who preceded humanity, who fashioned the first humans from clay mixed with divine substance, who established the first cities and assigned each city a divine guardian, who brought the gifts of agriculture, metallurgy, and law. The Sumerians did not believe their civilization grew slowly from the mud. They believed it was given to them, delivered, by beings who came from somewhere else. For 100 years, mainstream archaeology has treated those texts as mythology, as the natural human tendency to explain the unknown through divine narrative. That is a perfectly reasonable interpretation. But here is the problem with it. Other ancient mythological traditions tend to reflect the environment and circumstances of the people who created them. The Mesopotamian flood myth, for instance, makes perfect environmental sense for a people living in a flood-prone river delta. But the Anunnaki texts don't describe beings who look like the Sumerians or live like the Sumerians. They describe beings who came from a place called the Abzu, a deep underground realm, and from the heavens. They describe genetic manipulation. They describe the intentional modification of an existing creature, described in the texts as Lulu, to create the black-headed people. If you read those passages in a strictly literal context, they describe something that sounds less like mythology and more like a memory of an event. And could it be that what the Sumerians recorded in those texts was not pure invention, but a distorted recollection of a real encounter with a people or a technology so far beyond their understanding that the only framework available was divine narrative? There are those who believe the answer is yes. And one of the most famous of them staked everything on it. Zechariah Sitchin was a scholar of ancient languages born in Azerbaijan in 1920, who spent decades translating Sumerian as Akkadian and Babylonian texts. His conclusions were controversial in the extreme. He proposed that the Anunnaki were not mythological gods, but a technologically advanced civilization, possibly extraterrestrial, possibly from a planet he designated Nibiru, who arrived on Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago and genetically engineered the modern human species by combining their own DNA with that of early hominids. He cited specific Sumerian texts, including passages from the Atrahasis epic and the Enuma Elish, as literal historical accounts of this engineering. Mainstream scholars rejected his interpretations almost entirely. But here's something that is rarely mentioned in the dismissals. Before his death in 2010, Sitchin formally petitioned the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, which holds many of the remains from the Royal Cemetery at Ur, including the skeleton of a Sumerian high priestess known as Puabi, to allow DNA testing of those bones. He wanted to find out if her genome contained markers that didn't belong in any known human population. The museum declined. The bones remain unstudied at the genomic level to this day. What if the reason for that hesitation was not bureaucratic inertia? What if it was something more deliberate? Imagine standing in front of those cases in the Penn Museum. The golden headdress of Puabi under glass, the royal standard with its vivid mosaic panels, the golden lyres with their bullhead ornaments. The gold is impossibly bright under the lights, a sun-colored gleam that is not dimmed in 4,600 years. And somewhere in the storage rooms, behind those exhibits, the bones of the people who wore that gold are sitting in labeled boxes. Their DNA has never been fully sequenced. Yes, their genetic story remains untold. In an era when we can extract ancient DNA from a clay brick, when we can sequence the genome of a man who died 4,500 years ago in Egypt, why have the remains from the Royal Cemetery at Ur, arguably the most significant Sumerian burial site ever excavated, been kept away from the geneticists? Who decides what gets tested and what doesn't? And who benefits from certain answers never arriving? Leonard Woolley excavated the Royal Cemetery of Ur between 1922 and 1934. What he found there remains among the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries in history. 16 royal tombs, elaborately furnished with gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and carnelian, and surrounding the bodies of the royal dead. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of attendants who had willingly, or otherwise, followed their masters into death. In the tomb of Queen Puabi, 74 attendants were found, arranged in orderly rows, dressed in their finest, holding the instruments they had played at the final feast. The scale of organized human sacrifice was staggering. But even more staggering was what Woolley noticed about some of the skulls. A number of them were unusually elongated, a morphological characteristic that appeared nowhere else in the regional population. It was enough of an anomaly that researchers noted it in subsequent studies of the skeletal material, describing what they called exceptional morphologies of shape and robusticity in the Ur remains. What if those unusual skull shapes were not deformation, not the result of head binding practiced by some ancient cultures, but a natural characteristic, a physical marker of a population that was genuinely biologically distinct from its neighbors? Consider this. Elongated skulls have been documented at ancient sites across an extraordinary range of geographies. In Peru, in Egypt, in Malta, in the Caucasus, in the Crimea. At each site, the mainstream explanation is ritual cranial deformation. But deformation changes the shape of the skull without changing its volume. Some of the elongated skulls from these sites, notably the Paracas skulls of Peru, and certain specimens from the Black Sea region, have been reported to show enlarged cranial capacity, not merely reshaping. Initial DNA testing on some Paracas specimens reportedly produced results that didn't match any known human population on Earth. The reports were never formally peer-reviewed. The results were never independently confirmed. The scientist who conducted the preliminary tests maintained until her death that she had found what she found. And what if the skulls from the tombs of Ur belong to the same biological conversation? What if the answer to the Sumerian problem is sitting in a storage box in Philadelphia, waiting for someone to dare ask the question properly? Here's where the story takes another turn. Because something happened in 2023 that proved beyond any doubt that ancient DNA can be extracted from Mesopotamian artifacts in conditions that were once considered impossible. Our researchers published a study in the journal Nature Scientific Reports, detailing successful DNA extraction from a clay brick recovered from the palace of the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II, who ruled from 883 to 859 BCE. The brick was manufactured by being pressed in a mold, incorporating organic material, plant fibers, straw, and apparently the DNA of the laborers who worked the clay. Yes, the ancient genetic material was not only recoverable, but interpretable. The researchers were able to establish population affinities for the ancient Assyrians, to place them within the broader genetic landscape of the ancient Near East. Now here's the question that ought to be screaming. If we can extract DNA from a fired clay brick that is nearly 3,000 years old, a brick, a common building material, what happens when we apply the same techniques to the actual bones sitting in those museum vaults? What happens when someone finally looks at the full genome of the people buried in the Royal Cemetery of Ur? What happens, perhaps, is exactly what the 2025 study begins to suggest. And the answer, the partial answer, the one that sent researchers into hushed conversations at academic conferences and scattered across the genetics forums in fragmented and careful sentences, comes back to that haunting number. 20%, that Mesopotamian genetic signal in the ancient Egyptian genome. That GG2 alpha 2 haplogroup pointing from Sumer toward the Caucasus Mountains. Two data points that, separately, could be explained away. Together, they begin to sketch the outline of a population that moved through the ancient world with purpose, leaving civilization in its wake. Egypt, Mesopotamia, and what if there were others? Picture this, a map of the ancient world, circa 4000 BCE. You are looking at the globe as it was. There are no roads, no national borders, no internet, no satellites mapping the terrain from above. What there are, what scientists are increasingly identifying, are corridors of human movement. River valleys, coastlines, mountain passes. The ancient DNA record is beginning to reveal that these corridors were used by a surprisingly small number of distinct genetic lineages, and that those lineages carried with them, wherever they went, the seeds of what we call civilization. The wheel, writing, agriculture, astronomy, law. These technologies did not appear independently in a dozen places. They spread. They traveled with people. And some researchers are beginning to ask whether one specific group, the genetic group whose shadow we can glimpse in ancient Sumerian bones, was the catalyst for that spread, not a global empire, not an alien invasion. Something more subtle and in some ways more extraordinary. A people who were simply ahead of their time by several thousand years, and who eventually disappeared, absorbed, replaced, overwritten by the very civilizations they helped create. The Akkadians absorbed the Sumerians around 2300 BCE. When the Akkadian king Sargon the Great conquered the Sumerian city-states and created the world's first empire, the Sumerian language was gradually replaced by Akkadian in everyday use, though it persisted in religious and scholarly contexts for another 2,000 years, like Latin in medieval Europe, precisely because it carried sacred knowledge no one wanted to lose. But the people who spoke it natively, who carried the specific genetic profile the 2025 tests were tracking, were gone, absorbed, diluted. There are those who believe this process, the genetic absorption of the founding population, was not accidental. That civilizations, once established, almost inevitably destroy the uniqueness of the people who built them. not through malice, but through simple demographic replacement. A founding population of perhaps a few thousand people, arriving with advanced knowledge and the right genetic gifts, would be swamped within centuries by the millions of ordinary humans who adopted their culture. Could it be that this is what happened to the Sumerians? That the world's first civilization was built by a group so small, so genetically concentrated, that their biological signatures simply dissolved into the larger gene pool within a few generations, leaving only echoes in ancient bones and traces in unexpected modern populations? That brings us to perhaps the most unsettling question raised by the 2025 data. That's because if the Sumerian genetic signal is real, if it is as distinct and ancient and directionally consistent as the emerging research suggests, then there should be modern populations who carry it. Not perfectly, not purely, but somewhere in the tapestry of living human genetics, the Sumerian thread should still be visible if you know where to look. And some researchers believe they've found it. The Armenians, the Georgians, and the Assyrians of modern Iraq and Syria, the ancient Christian community who have lived in the Mesopotamian heartland for millennia, and who speak a Semitic language descended from Akkadian, but who carry a distinct genetic substrate that predates the Arab conquest of Mesopotamia by thousands of years. That is, there are genetic studies suggesting that certain populations in the Caucasus and the Zagros mountain region carry ancestry profiles that align more closely with ancient Mesopotamian samples than with any of their modern neighbors. Whether that reflects Sumerian ancestry specifically, or simply the underlying ancient Near Eastern population that preceded all of these civilizations, is a question the geneticists are still debating with some heat. But the data keeps pointing in the same direction, north, into the mountains, toward the high places that the Sumerians themselves, in their texts, repeatedly describe as sacred. The mountain of the east, the abode of the gods, the place where the Anunnaki were said to hold their councils. What if those mountains were not metaphor? What if they were geography? What if the Sumerian religious fixation on mountain temples, their ziggurats, after all, were deliberate artificial mountains, had constructed on flat plains by a people who had never lived near a mountain? Was a cultural memory? A built echo of a homeland they had left? There are those who say the ziggurat was not merely a temple platform. It was a monument to longing. A people who had come down from the high places, who had built their civilization on the flat, alluvial plain of Mesopotamia, but who looked at the horizon every day and saw nothing but flatness for as far as the eye could see. And so they built their mountains themselves, stone by stone, generation by generation, as if to tell the gods, and perhaps to remind themselves, where they had come from. That theory can't be proven, but neither can it be dismissed. And here is what makes the 2025 DNA findings so genuinely revolutionary, not just for archaeology, but for our understanding of what it means to be human. Every human civilization we know of, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley culture, ancient China, the Olmec of Mesoamerica, appears in the archaeological record with a speed that still confuses researchers. The standard model of civilizational development, gradual accumulation, slow technological progress, organic growth, doesn't fully account for the explosive complexity of these cultures in their earliest documented phases. The Sumerians of 3500 BCE were not building simple huts. They were engineering complex irrigation systems, managing city populations in the tens of thousands, maintaining diplomatic correspondence across hundreds of miles, and recording interest-bearing loans and legal contracts in a standardized script. The appearance of that level of complexity, that suddenly, in the archaeological record, raises a question that the genetics may finally be in a position to help answer. Or was it learned? Or was it remembered? What if what we call the birth of civilization was actually the rebirth of it? What if the people who built Sumer were survivors, not of a mythological flood, but of a real catastrophic event, a collapse of a pre-existing culture sophisticated enough to have laid the groundwork for everything that followed? As some researchers point to the Younger Dryas impact event of approximately 10,800 BCE, a series of cosmic impacts or catastrophic flooding that may have wiped out entire coastal civilizations at the end of the last ice age. Civilizations we have never found because their ruins lie under 100 meters of seawater on continental shelves worldwide. As the genetic signal pointing from ancient Sumerian bones to the Caucasus Mountains could be the biological fingerprint of the survivors of exactly such an event. People who carried their knowledge with them to the high ground, preserved it through the dark centuries after catastrophe, and descended again when the waters receded to build something new from the memories of something old. That idea has been growing steadily in the fringes of archaeology and quietly in the mainstream. Graham Hancock has been making a version of this argument for 30 years, and the scientific establishment has spent most of that time dismissing it. But the ancient DNA revolution has changed the terms of the debate. Because when researchers find haplogroup profiles in ancient Sumerian bones that don't match any regional population, that point instead to a distant mountain range and to populations that are themselves genetically ancient. It forces a question that the dismissals can no longer comfortably contain. Where did these people come from before they were Sumerians? That's not a fringe question anymore. It is a question printed in the journal Nature. And here's what none of the official papers say directly, but what several researchers have whispered at the margins of the published data. The genetic differentiation found in the early Sumerian samples is not consistent with a gradual migration from any identified source population. It's consistent with a bottleneck, a founder effect, the genetic signature of a very small population that moved into a new territory rapidly and expanded from there. The kind of founder effect you see when a group of survivors, perhaps dozens of individuals, perhaps a few hundred, carry an entire civilization's worth of knowledge in their heads and their hands and their bones, and find a place to begin again. In genetics, that kind of event leaves a mark that persists for millennia. A narrow genetic profile that spreads through an expanding population like ink dropped into still water, thinning as it spreads but never entirely disappearing. What if the 2025 results are the detection of that ink? The last detectable traces of whoever, wherever, whatever came before Sumer. The clay tablets have been trying to tell us something for 150 years. Ever since Austin Henry Layard dug up the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh in 1849 and shipped thousands of cuneiform tablets back to the British Museum, scholars have been reading the Sumerian record. And the Sumerian record, in text after text, says the same thing in different ways. We did not create ourselves. Knowledge was given to us. Our cities were laid out by divine instruction. Our laws descended from the sky. The Sumerian King List, a document cataloging the rulers of Sumer, begins with the statement that kingship descended from heaven. It then lists 8 kings who ruled before the Great Flood, with reign lengths measured in tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the list resumes with shorter reigns. That's more human-scale dynasties, more recognizable history. As if something fundamental changed. As if the flood was not just a natural disaster, but a dividing line, before and after, in the story of a people who remembered something they could no longer fully access. Is it possible that those 8 pre-flood kings represent a cultural memory of a real antediluvian civilization? One that the 2025 DNA is beginning to give us a biological address for? Most archaeologists say no. But the pre-flood reigns are mythology, they say, symbolic numbers, sacred mathematics. And they may be right. But consider the following. The Sumerian flood narrative, recorded in the Epic of Zusudra, describes a survivor who preserves the seed of mankind and the knowledge of the gods. It predates the biblical flood story by at least 1,000 years and shares specific structural details: the construction of a vessel, the release of birds to test for dry land, divine instruction, that are either coincidental parallels or evidence of a shared source tradition. A tradition pointing back to an event so foundational that multiple cultures, separated by geography, preserved its echo across millennia. What if that shared source tradition has a genetic component? What if the peoples who carried the flood memory from culture to culture were the same people the DNA is now pointing toward? The Caucasus, the high places, are the mountains where the waters couldn't reach? The 2025 results are not the end of this story. They are, researchers quietly agree, very much the beginning. The ancient DNA field is accelerating at a pace that would have seemed impossible 10 years ago. Every year brings new techniques, new samples, new populations added to the genetic database. The remains in museum vaults across Europe, America, and Iraq are increasingly being viewed not as historical relics, but as biological archives. Hard drives written in 4-base code, waiting to be read. And as those archives are decoded, layer by layer, a picture is beginning to emerge that matches almost none of the textbook narratives about where humanity came from and how civilization arose. Something happened in the ancient Near East. Something remarkable and strange and not yet fully understood. And the bones of the Sumerians, those silent witnesses to the world's first cities, its first laws, its first love songs, and its first laments, are finally beginning to speak. Here is what we do know, assembled from the fragments of verified data. An unpublished but circulated Sumerian DNA sample has been assigned to Y haplogroup G2-alpha-2, placing the tested individual genetically closest to populations from the Armenian and Caucasian highlands. A formal study published in Nature in July 2025 demonstrated that an ancient Egyptian from the Old Kingdom period carried approximately 20% of his genome from ancient Mesopotamian populations, linking the two oldest writing civilizations on Earth through biology as well as culture. Ancient DNA research from Mesopotamia, published in peer-reviewed journals, has documented what researchers describe as a West Asian Neolithic continuum with pulses of migration that contributed to early Near Eastern farmers and left distinct genetic strata in the Sumerian cultural zone. And the Sumerian language, the medium through which humanity first recorded its thoughts, remains a biological orphan, with no living relatives and no identified homeland. These are the facts. Small and strange and frustratingly incomplete. And then there's everything the facts don't explain. Why does the Sumerian genetic signature point to the mountains when the Sumerian civilization existed on the plains? Why does a genome from ancient Egypt carry Mesopotamian ancestry at a time when these two cultures were supposedly independent? Why does the Sumerian king list describe 8 rulers with inhuman reign lengths before acknowledging human-scale history? Why do the Sumerian texts describe their gods in such specific, physical, operational terms, not as cosmic forces or weather phenomena, but as beings who worked, who argued, who created and modified living things with what the texts describe as divine craft? Why did the Sumerians, who had no mountains in their landscape, build mountains anyway? And why, when the genetics community gets close to a definitive answer about who these people really were, does the full data always seem to be just one more study away? There are really only a few possibilities. The first is the one most archaeologists will publicly defend. The Sumerians were a regional population, somewhat distinct genetically from their neighbors due to specific migration patterns from the Zagros Caucasus region. who happened to develop civilization first due to a fortunate combination of geography, climate, and accumulated cultural innovation. The DNA anomalies are real, but explainable within the framework of known human population movements. The second possibility is something that sits at the edge of the scientific conversation, where mainstream researchers are careful with their words. The Sumerians were the survivors of a pre-existing advanced culture, displaced by catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age, who carried preserved knowledge into the Mesopotamian plains and rebuilt as much as they could from memory. The DNA traces back to where they waited out the catastrophe, the mountains. The third possibility is the one that lives outside the framework entirely, in the space where ancient texts and anomalous genetic data and unsolved mysteries meet. That the Sumerian origin story is not mythology, and that the beings the Sumerians described as the Anunnaki were real, and that whatever intervention they performed left a trace in human DNA that we are only now, in 2025, beginning to detect. Not one of those explanations is fully proven. Not one of them can be definitively ruled out. The DNA is real. The anomalies are real. The mystery of the Sumerian language is real. The questions are real. What comes next? What the full analysis of the museum bone samples will show? What the Göbekli Tepe genetic data will reveal when it's finally published? What happens when someone applies the latest sequencing technology to the bones of Queen Puabi is still unwritten. The tablets are still being deciphered. The bones are still being read. And somewhere in a climate-controlled room in a museum that would rather not have this conversation, the answers may already be waiting. What do you think really happened? What does it mean if the people who gave humanity writing and law and the wheel were themselves the remnants of something older, something lost, and something that the waters of an ancient catastrophe covered up, and that only the genetic code, 4 billion years of evolutionary memory compressed into every cell, is now uncovering? Share your thoughts in the comments. This is one of those mysteries where every perspective adds a piece to a puzzle that may never be fully solved. And your instinct about what's really being concealed here matters as much as any laboratory result. Keep your minds open, and until we meet again, stay curious.